And then you also mentioned New York, where before, we run out of time, I want to
Yeah.
talk about New York because of the incredible amount of Black influence there. You basically, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but seem to posture that it was the most influential Black voting bloc in the country, or something to that effect. There was an incredible story about how spooked Martin van Buren got about Black enfranchisement. Talk a little bit about that. Take us through that history in the early 19th century.
Well, try to do it very briefly.
No, it
Um,
doesn't need to be brief. I
no,
just want to
well,
make time for you.
they're New York, greater New York City. New York City then was just New York County, Manhattan. The five boroughs that are today New York City, meaning all of Eastern Long Island, the counties up the Hudson, and even the northeastern counties in New Jersey, is one of the largest slave operating, enslaved labor using places in the country. Most of the Dutch farmers, whether in Brooklyn or what is today Bergen County, what is today Nassau County, what is today Ulster, all of those counties, at one point or another, this is not my work, this is the work of a terrific historian named Craig Stephen Wilder. Those Dutch farmers, and they're a very powerful ethnic class interest, they either bought or hired enslaved labor for their big farms. So there were lots of Black men all over that region, many of whom claimed freedom during the Revolution when the British came in. And, there's several decades there where the best thing, to put it in kind of, the best thing an enslaved person could see is, a British ship in the harbor, because that means that you have a chance at freedom. And that was true during the War of 1812. So right up through, Washington, when Washington marches into New York finally in 1783, the British general refusing to give him back his property, they watched the British ships leave with thousands of formerly enslaved people. But there are thousands left there. And so there's the basis for an extremely active and militant politics, because the British had actually, in many ways, liberated them. A lot of Black men had been guerrilla fighters for the British, occupying the blockhouses on the Hudson. So they've got a lot of numbers, and they're fired up. They're not like the Philadelphians. They're not cautious. They're a fired up constituency. They start voting really early, even though there's still 4,000 enslaved people in 1827. Sojourner Truth was born a slave in 1814 up the Hudson. So you've got all these enslaved people, and then all these people who bought their freedom or run away and change their name. So it's a very dynamic environment. And by the early 1800s, they are in New York City and in Brooklyn, what is today Brooklyn, a pretty mobilized constituency. They control certain trades, notably chimney sweeping, which is a dirty, dangerous job, and they use small children. It's pretty exploitative. And they are being courted by both parties. And they reach a peak of influence in sort of 1810, 1813, when Black men in New York have enough votes to swing the entire city's assembly delegation. This is a complicated story, but it's really something. And if you swing the New York City assembly delegation, you could control the whole assembly. And if you control the assembly, you're pretty close to controlling the entire patronage pot of New York, 15,000 jobs. The assembly will name every officer in the state. The mayor of New York City will be named by the state legislator. That's 15,000 jobs at a time when the entire federal patronage pool is 3,000. So this is big time politics, and the Black vote's really crucial. So once again, what will later be Democrats, Martin van Buren's Bucktail Republicans, which are really the basis for the National Democratic Party in the 1820s, they mobilized to get rid of this big empowered Black vote. It's a hard fought. It takes 10 years, 1811, 1821. And they finally succeed in passing a huge, high property requirement for Black men. You couldn't just be well off. You couldn't be a professional. You had to own land, a freehold worth $250. That's a big farm.
Right.
1821. So it was effectively completely disfranchising, but with a little fig leaf. The second part of my chapters on New York, though, which I think I'm building on some work that other people did, but I have a lot of, look at the census. By the late 1850s, through a whole variety of maneuvers and techniques, the Black electorate has rebuilt itself, and they are claiming 11,000 votes in New York State. Now, New York State is a huge electorate, hundreds and hundreds of thousands, but it's enough to count. And they have become an organized submachine wing of the Republican Party in the later 1850s. And this has taken 20 years of work and a concentration of leadership unlike anywhere else in the country. This is why Douglas went to New York, went to Rochester, because he wanted to be where the action was. They've got Douglas, Henry Highland Garnett, Samuel Ringgold Ward, and then you could, another 15 or 20 top leaders, all in New York State, all deeply tied into partisan politics. So that's kind of, in some ways, the center of the book. I call it the New York battleground.
And then, I mean, that's kind of where the Republican Party seems to coalesce in this area, and the separate parties that had been vying for black votes and black liberation from more radical perspectives, right, they kind of fell by the wayside a little bit. I wanted to ask a broader question about our history and what this says about the nature of progress, because so much of this, you see things progress, things regress, they're regional, they take decades, there are different iterations of it that lack success but have good intentions, and then additionally how this progress is completely washed over in our historical context. I mean, like, I think of, this is such a silly example, but it's like the Mississippi burning effect, right? Where now, the FBI was the one who really beat down the KKK.
Yeah.
It's just the white Union soldiers are the ones responsible for black liberation. Like, I mean, how much of that is, what's your take on that, really?
Well, I mean, I think over the past, really since Obama's election, I think that I myself have had to reconsider I would not have said that I'm attached to a narrative of progress, but I probably was, naively, and because of my subject position, which is, look at me, right? I think what was done to Obama, the rise of vicious white nationalist politics to block everything, and the inability of the Democratic Party, which he had to do anything about that, and then, of course, Trump. I think American historians should just completely dispense with any notion of progress. And I do not mean, however, I want to be clear, I do not mean that we should substitute for a notion of progress, a liberal notion, a Whig history of getting better all the time, that we should substitute a dystopian, always was just this way. I'm not going with either one of those. I think we just have to accept that American history, whatever that means, the history of the United States, has always been a history of intense conflict that is unresolved. Eric Foner called Reconstruction America's unfinished revolution. I think the revolution itself was, to say the least, unfinished. Reconstruction was unfinished, and here we are. And so we have to accept and enter into the constancy, the permanency of this struggle, and that it is, in fact, at the level of cities and states, that we have to be very wary of single national narratives, those mostly obscure realities. We have to get down into the nitty-gritty and down into the weeds. And if we do that, we say, oh, well, I mean, here's this struggle that was successful for a while. And but success always breeds more problems. Any political success, actual political success, the second Reconstruction, civil rights movement of the 50s, 60s, 70s, sure, it ended Jim Crow, formal Jim Crow. For the first time in 1868, the majority of African-American people could vote. And here we are now. That was a success, right? We go from 100 Black elected officials in 1964 to 24,000 now, right? That's a great success, but look where we are. That we can't have any happy tales. So for me, give up on progress, but also do not succumb to the idea that there is no real history, that it's always just existing, the same all the way through. It's not the same all the way through. History is based, there will be change. What kind of change is the question?
Right. Well, wise words, Van Goss, professor of history at Franklin Marshall College, and your book is called The First Reconstruction, Black Politics in America, From Revolution to the Civil War. Thank you so much, Van, for your time today.
Thank you very much.
Folks, there's more of what you've just saw where that came from. That's if you hit the subscribe and like button. Thank you. Really, thank you.